Don't wait until the end. Okay, so my name is Kamessi. I recently graduated from MIT Operations Research Center. Right now this year, I'm doing a postdoc at Waymo supply optimization team. Like Waymo is the company that builds all of this autonomous vehicle that you see today. And I'm going to join Stanford this July. So today I'm going to talk about a work that I finished doing my PhD. It is called two-sided flexibility in platforms. And it is a joint work with my PhD advisor, Daniel Freund at MIT, and my collaborator, Sebastian Martin from Northwestern Kellogg. So as reviewed by the title of this work, my research broadly revolves around the operations of platforms, especially platforms in the gig economy space. So gig economy is like just a sharing economy. So you can think of platforms like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb. And I'm particularly interested in improving the efficiency of these platforms through flexibility designs. So what do I mean by that? For those of you who are familiar with operations research, this concept has a long history in OR, but remains relatively underexplored in platform settings. So my research looked at different ways that this classical operational concept could translate to modern platforms. Let me give you two concrete examples. A classic concept of flexibility in operations research is the so-called dual source, which basically means sourcing from multiple suppliers. And traditionally, people look at dual sourcing in manufacturing settings, like sourcing from Mexico versus China, sourcing like renewable energy versus like traditional energy type. This dual sourcing idea is very common. However, dual sourcing actually also applies to the gig economy setting. For example, the Uber drivers, they are famous for being a flexible supply type because many of them work as independent contractors with flexible schedules. And this type of flexibility that they provide can be very helpful when they are complemented with a more rigid fleet of autonomous vehicles. Like, for example, what Uber is doing today in Phoenix, where they essentially have a fleet of autonomous vehicles accompanied also by their human drivers. So one of my work looked at this dual sourcing problem in a gig economy setting. And in contrast to dual sourcing in traditional manufacturing setting, the challenge here is that it's due to the self-scheduling nature of human drivers. They make their own decisions over whether to join the platform, and they do not participate if the platform do not utilize or pay them well enough. And that introduces some novel incentive management problem. If you're interested in this work, I'd be more than happy to talk about it offline, or like if we have a few minutes left. Aside from it, another important concept of flexibility is the so-called process flexibility. And what is meant by this is essentially like compatibility between supply and demand. And there are similar flexibility designs that are used in modern platforms. And today we're going to draw a contrast between this traditional compatibility idea of flexibility and this flexibility design idea in platforms. I'm going to talk about the motivation in a lot more detail, but when it comes to like these flexibility incentives, just think about, for example, the wait and save discount used by Uber, the relocation incentives like that Uber uses for drivers, both of which are basically financial incentives that try to encourage the agent that participate in the platform to be more flexible, to be more accommodating in the service or in what type of trips that they accept. So this will be the focus of today. We're going to look at this type of incentives that occur on both the supply and demand side of the market and look at how best to structure this type of incentives. With that, let me dive into the motivation of this work. For those of you who are familiar with the operations research literature, there's a long stream of research that focuses on the so-called process flexibility, which studies essentially compatibility in a manufacturing system. So for example, this seminal work by Jordan and Graves considers essentially a bipartite graph with products on one side and plants on the other side. And the edges between them essentially capture whether a product can be produced by a plant. So right now there's basically like a one-by-one design. And it is shown that there is actually significant value in adding these red edges into the system to form what is called a long chain design. Through this design, these red edges are going to be very helpful for hedging against stochasticity in demand. Because now, when the demand for product one is high, it can be fulfilled by both plant one and plant two. And in particular, we don't need this graph to be complete. A little flexibility goes a long way. So this is a classical result. So given that, introducing just a little bit more additional edges into the system could be very valuable, it is natural to ask, in modern platforms, can we use a similar concept to facilitate matching? So let's think about it. Let's take a look at this picture and do a brainstorming together. In this platform setting, the decision maker, like Uber, similarly faces a bipartite structure with drivers on one side and riders on the opposite side. And between them, there are edges that capture whether a driver can serve a ride. So for example, this rider here, she has no eligible edges because all of the drivers are far away and the wait time is too long for her. And then the platform essentially solves a matching problem based on these available edges. However, despite the similar bipartite structure that we're seeing here, the important difference in the platform setting is that the edges are stochastic. Well, the platform can use various incentives, like the ones that I've shown you before, to try to make, for example, a driver or like a rider to be more flexible. These edges essentially realize stochastically, and we cannot just configure this compatibility as in the manufacturing setting. So flexibility is a very different stochastic concept when it comes to platforms. Let me give you more concrete examples. Uber has a feature called Wait and Save. Maybe you have tried it before, but I'm such a frequent user of this feature because it gives me discounts. But from the perspective of Uber, why does it make sense from the Uber's perspective to give users this discount? For example, let's take a look at this rider here. This rider here, if previously she has no eligible edges, but if she's willing to wait for 18 minutes as opposed to just 8 minutes for this discount, then she could be compatible with drivers within a wider radius. For example, she could now be compatible with these two cars that were previously too far away. And these additional feasible edges can create more matches in the system. So that is why platforms are offering this type of incentives. But of course, even with those incentives, the realization of these edges remains stochastic. And it's totally possible that even after incentivizing this rider, she still cannot be matched because the location is just very adversarial. And similar incentives are also used, for example, in Uber Eats. There's a feature called no rush delivery option, which similarly provides a discount if a customer is willing to be flexible with the wait time. And in fact, the pricing for this type of incentives is exactly what I worked on in summer 2023 and 2024 when I was interning at Uber. And this type of incentives can, in general, be very effective in creating more matches. Now, on the supply side of the graph, this type of incentives are actually also very common. So for example, Uber has this feature called the quiz bonus that provides a bonus to any driver that completes multiple consecutive rides. So why would platform do that? For example, if Uber tries to assign this driver to a passenger that is 10 minutes away as opposed to the regular 5 minutes dispatch, the driver may want to decline this ride and instead accept a better match from a competing company, say Lyft. But now with this incentive, the driver has yet another reason to stay committed to the platform and accept these patches that previously would seem too undesirable to him. And similar incentives include, for example, relocation incentives and this type of bonuses that try to encourage the driver to accept less desirable dispatches. In the paper, we talk about some other examples, not just ride hailing. And the key message here is just to say that, a lot of platforms today, they want to facilitate matches and they use flexibility incentives on both supply and demand side. And all of these incentives back the question of what flexibility structure creates the most matches. So for example, here I'm illustrating the flexible agents by row. So is it better to have the flexible agents appear on one side of the graph? Or is it better to have some flexible agents across both sides? This is a question that we study in light of all these examples that we see today. And to answer this question, we're going to consider our parsimonious model of maximum matching in sparse bipartite random graphs. So basically, we want to make as many matches as possible, and we consider a graph to refine this metric. This model will provide us with results on how flexibility should be structured on the supply and demand side, and will highlight their implications for platform experimentation. If there are any additional questions about the context, please let me know. And before I dive into the model. Okay, yes.
Sounds really interesting and training. Do you think in this work, maybe I'm not saying it's a first order thing, but about competition in the sense that, in the manufacturing, we typically think we would like everything to be connected, but in the platforms, everyone, having everyone connected, create also competition and kind of.
You're right.
weird effects that may happen.
Yes, you're going to see that in the platform experimentation section, and I will hide it as a secret, but you can infer this computation from this geometry. Okay. Yeah, so I'll be talking about that aspect.
Sorry, can I
Yeah.
ask just a clarifying question? So it's not obvious to me that maximizing the number of matches is a relevant goal.
You're right. You're
In
right.
that, you know, to achieve flexibility, you might use discounting, and this could, you know, not be beneficial for, say, net profit.
Yeah.
So can they be the same thing, or?
They're not the same thing.
Okay.
And the only reason that we're going to look at maximum matching is because up until this point, for all of this, we're only going to look at a given number of flexible agents, but just focus on the allocation question.
Okay.
So for the first part of this talk, we're only going to look at the question of, suppose I have a given number of flexible agents, how do I structure it across the two sides? So the cost becomes irrelevant. However, like in this final part, I'll show you how cost plays a role in this project.
I follow.
Yeah, this is mostly because this idea that a little flexibility goes a long way is already super well established. So it's natural, like if we focus instead on this quantity question, it is only natural that, you know, the first flexible agents will be very valuable, and then there are some decreasing marginal return. So this is a very natural effect, but this is not the focus of this presentation. Okay, cool. So let me dive into the model. So in our model, we're going to consider an asymptotic setting where there are n nodes on each side, and we scale n to infinity. This is like we assume symmetry here just for simplicity, and towards the end, for the extensions, I'll show you what happens. And the first layer of randomness in this model have to do with the nodes, which can be either this flexible red node or this regular blue node. And on the left-hand side, a node is flexible with probability BL, which stands on the left, and on the right-hand side is flexible with probability BR. So these probabilities BL and BR are the key decision variables of the model. And after we know the nodes, we can start to draw these random edges. And as we have seen in the examples before, the flexible nodes are supposed to be more likely to form edges. So we capture this by assuming that this red edge, which occurs between two flexible agents, realizes with probability 2 times alpha f over n, whereas this black edge, which connects one regular and one flexible node, realizes with slightly smaller probability. And this blue edge, which occurs between two regular nodes, realizes with the least probability. Now, this is really an additive way to model flexibility, because you can interpret this 2 times alpha f as, you know, like alpha f plus alpha f because there are two flexible nodes, and this alpha f plus alpha as, you know, like one regular node and one flexible. We make this additive assumption for a reason, and I'll highlight that in just 2 slides. And here divided by n is just to ensure that we're in an asymptotic regime where the probability of matching is not just like always 0 or 1 with high probability. And the metric that we defined is maximum matching. So what is maximum match? Basically, match as many drivers and riders as possible. And notice that a maximum matching is not just a collection of all edges. So for instance, if we get these two realized edges, then we actually get only one match. Why? Because these two edges are incident to the same node, and only one of them could be useful as part of the matching. So matching is different from just a collection of all edges. And in particular, we focus on the following quantity: the expected size of a maximum matching divided by n. So basically, like we count, you know, like, and here the expectation is taken over the realization of the nodes and the edges. So basically, if you give me this flexibility probability BL and BR, I can then sample flexible nodes, sample flexible edges, and then find out a maximum matching for a given realization and take expectation. So you might be curious, how do we even think about this expectation, given that even for the edges, there are 2 to the power of n squared different ways for you to realize. And that is exactly the challenge of this problem. So for a particular realized edges, there are polynomial time algorithms to find out the maximum matching, but characterizing the expected size of this matching is in general a difficult quantity. And we'll highlight some technical contributions to this question later on, which could be of separate interest. So we call this quantity mu. It is parameterized by BL and BR. These are the key decision variables, and we call it matching probability because it captures the probability that a random node is part of the maximum matching. Now, having established the model, let me give you just one example and one question to highlight the context. Suppose that we can turn a quarter of the node to be flexible, as you have seen in this like red node sphere. Is it better to put like these 4 nodes on one side of the graph in what we call a one-sided allocation? Or is it better to put it in a balanced way across the 2 sides in what we call a balanced allocation? Which one do you think is better? I'm actually will collect a vote from you. So for you to remember the context, the flexible nodes are supposed to be more likely to form edges, and this red edges which occurs between 2 flexible nodes is even more likely, and this blue edge which occurs between 2 regular nodes is less likely. Anyone in favor of the one-sided allocation? Okay, a large number of you. How about the balanced allocation? Okay, slightly fewer. Oh, I love this audience. Nobody voted twice. Okay. Okay, so then I'm the bad guy because you cannot be wrong because either of these options can be optimal actually, depending on the type of platform that you're thinking about. And it depends on this alpha F and alpha parameters. So basically, depending on the market density, the answer to this question can be very different. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to highlight 2 effects that we call flexibility cannibalization and flexibility asymmetry that respectively determines which allocation is the best and in what kind of parameter genes each one of them would dominate.
So sorry, I may miss somewhere. Can you remind us what's the optimization variable here?
Yes, the optimization variables is BL and BR. And let me impose a constraint here. The specific question that we're going to focus on is we assume a given flexibility budget B. So you can think of it as we can incentivize a fixed fraction of agents to be flexible. And the question is, how do we allocate that budget across the 2 sides? So and we would like to find the allocation that is most conducive to matching, that maximizes this quantity mu. Now, coming back to this question of why we model flexibility in an additive way, you might have taken a guess, but this is because for any given budget, under this additive model, the expected number of edges in this graph is going to be the same. It does not depend on the allocation. But the expected number of matches, it does depend on the allocation. It not just depends on this capital B. So in other words, even with the same number of edges, depending on how you distribute these edges in this graph, the resulting matching outcome can be very different. And this is exactly what drives the power of, this question of 2-sided flexibility design. Because you care about not just how many edges are created through these incentives, but also where these edges are, because the resulting matching outcome can be very different. And this quantity mu is not one that we introduced. This study of asymptotic matching probability has a long history dating back to 1981 by the work of Karp and Sipser. The tools have this literature generally have phase limitations as we move into a denser regime, and they do not encapsulate our graph with this heterogeneity of flexible versus regular nodes. But luckily, instead of characterizing mu, our goal is to compare different allocations. And because of that, we're going to leverage a combination of different tools. This includes both tools, including a paired coupling argument that I'll show you later on, as well as some standard concentration bounds that one could use to compare different allocations without even computing mu in closed form. And I'm also going to extend this classical Karp-Sipser algorithm to a setting to this heterogeneous setting that we consider here. And of course, our work also relates to this long stream of literature on process flexibility. The early works in this stream of literature mostly focus on the quantity question of how much flexibility is optimal. And we instead take a different angle. We fix that quantity, but changes the allocation. So in that spirit, our work aligns more with the work that focus on the structural design of flexibility that is most valuable. But because the platform setting introduces some additional stochasticity, we're looking at a fundamentally different matching model as opposed to the manufacturing model.
And just for our audience, can you remind us what is matching?
Yes.
Matching.
Yeah. A maximum matching is basically a collection of edges, like the most number of edges, the most number of edges that you can select without having 2 edges that are incident to each other. So for example, if you have 3 nodes and the 2 nodes on the supply side are both connected with the agent on the demand side, then you cannot have 2 matches. You can only have 1 match because each agent can at most be matched with 1 agent on the opposite side. Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the secrets of why different allocations can be optimal at different, under different types of platforms. let me start with the one-sided allocation because, like a lot of you think that this is going to be like the dominant design, and indeed there is very strong intuition for that. So to see the intuition, let me focus on a setting where exactly half of the nodes are flexible. So in this case, I'm also using different colors to visualize the different edge probabilities. So in one-sided allocation, all of these edges are colored black because we're in a very homogeneous situation where all edges realize with the same probability. In contrast, in a balanced allocation, the edges, these red edges on the top, it realizes with a much higher probability, and these blue edges at the bottom realize with less probability. So it's a heterogeneous situation. And what we show is that this type of heterogeneity is actually bad for matching purposes. Why? Because the realized edges tend to concentrate in the top, while leaving the rest of the graph relatively sparse. So, for example, in these two realizations, there are 4 edges in both allocations. But in balanced allocation, there are only 3 matches because there's 2 of these red edges are incident to the same node, and only one of them could be used for matching purposes. So maybe this relates a little bit to your point on competition. It's essentially saying like facilitating too many feasible matches in the same region does not help because there is this strong concavity going on, and the value of like additional edges decrease within a subregion. And to see what this means in a right-handed platform setting, let me give you one example. It's basically saying that we're using incentives to incentivize the driver to be flexible, so they have multiple incident edges. And we're also incentivizing the rider to be flexible, so they also have lots of incident edges. But eventually, like we can only match like one driver with one rider. So for example, we should be matching this driver with this rider here, and we should be matching this rider with this driver here. So this red edge is essentially created for nothing. It doesn't lead to so we're essentially paying twice of that flexibility to create a match to create an edge that doesn't contribute to additional matches. So the first result in this paper shows that when half of the nodes are flexible and when alpha is equal to 0, so that only flexible nodes make edges. In this case, the one-sided allocation always dominates. I'm going to show you a brief sketch of this coupling proof behind it, because it actually very strongly connects with this intuition of cannibalization. And after that, I'm going to show you how we can relax these 2 restrictions here using a more general machine. So the idea of the coupling is as follows. Within the parameter regimes considered in the theorem, in the one-sided allocation, we're really just in a homogeneous situation where all edges realize with probability alpha f over n because alpha is taken to 0. And in the balanced allocation, in contrast, these red edges, they realize with twice that probability, and there are no edges in this lower subgraph. So to some extent, you can view these red edges as 2 groups of edges, each of whom realize with that probability. So it's basically saying, like in balanced allocation, we're moving one group of edges from the bottom to the top. Now, to prove that the balanced allocation is actually worse than one-sided, the coupling proof goes as follows. It's going to show that we can move one group of the edges that is currently on top to the bottom to create more matches. So that is the whole idea. And to do that, we're going to slightly modify the edge generation process, construct the coupling, and then make a comparison. So for the edge generation process, all we have to do is to assume that these edges are really just directed edges that are generated by the flexible node. So in one-sided allocation, each node on the left-hand side generates an edge toward the right-hand side with probability alpha f over n. And similarly in the balanced allocation. But in balanced allocation, there are also edges on the opposite side, and they also generate an edge toward the left-hand side with the same probability. So to differentiate these different kinds of edges, let me color the edges in 4 different colors, depending on whether they're generated from left to right, right to left, and whether they are generated to the top or the bottom of the other graph. So here's one example. So basically, there are these 2 groups of cross-sectional edges, as well as 2 groups of edges that are within them, depending on whether they are generated by the flexible nodes on the left or the right. And the idea is that because there are 2 groups of edges in the top subgraph, can we actually move one of these edges from the top to the bottom to create more matches, like this one here? It turns out that this idea actually does not work, because for a particular realization, it is totally possible that this lower subgraph happens to be denser as compared with the upper subgraph. So what do we do with it? The trick here is that instead of coupling one realization of the balanced and one-sided allocation, we're going to couple two realizations of the balance and one-sided allocation. And for any particular realization of the balance allocation, we're going to construct a copy. This copy has all this, like there's two groups of edges in the top subgraph, but it's going to flip this cross-sectional green and yellow edges around the middle of the graph in order to cancel out the asymmetry that's introduced in the top and the bottom. And then we can do this similar coupling idea. We can copy all but the pink edges directly from A to C, from B to D, and then we flip the pink edges from the top of the graph to the bottom of the graph. And then the coupling works in the sense that we'll be able to show that the combined matching size in graph A and B is smaller than or equal to the combined matching size in graph C and D. In other words, individually, due to the asymmetry in the graph, there is no hope in showing that A is smaller than or equal to C or B is smaller than or equal to D. But if we do this flipping, if we create a copy, then we can show this result. And sometimes one can show that we can even get a bonus match, as I show you here. So this inequality can be strict. And we characterize it to show that in expectation, the one-sided allocation dominates the balanced allocation. Now, coming back to this theorem, probably this result gives you an overview of, like what is exactly that's driving the result. More generally, one can relax this second assumption here, this alpha equal to 0 assumption, using a more general but less intuitive technique. It is called the Kamessi algorithm. And intuitively, it's basically saying that, in this graph, we iteratively add edges that are incident to degree 1 nodes. Let me show you what this means. Let's start from an empty set of matching. We first add this edge into the matching because it is incident to a node that only has degree 1. So basically, this is its only neighbor. And in a sparse random graph, this operation is provably optimal to add this as part of the maximum matching. Once we have added this into the matching, this edge here no longer be added because it is incident to an existing match. So we delete it. And then this node here becomes a degree 1 node. So we add this node into the matching, so on and so forth. So basically, what Kamessi does is to treat the graph as a tree and to iteratively prune starting from the leaves of the tree. So this is a leaf because this is the only this node only has this one incident edge.
There's a question from the audience.
Yes.
I think it's not about proof, but the question is it possible to demonstrate that with flexibility incentive or market design, more customers are changing from inflexible side to flexible ones?
Yes. This is a more behavioral question, I guess. Based on my experience, so I cannot answer it from my model here because it's a theoretical model. So I can only answer this question from the experience at Uber. So at Uber Eats, there are all kinds of levers that people use to make a customer more or less flexible. So for example, paying the customer so that this customer is willing to wait for a bit longer. And also directly showing the customer a longer ETA so that the customer knows that my order is not going to arrive in time. And similarly on the courier side, sometimes if an order has been lingering for so long without anybody accepting it, sometimes the platform would subsidize this order just so that this order is eventually delivered. So there are all kinds of financial incentives that people use to incentivize flexibility.
But it's not part of your model.
No, right now it's not.
I see.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so because this is a tree-like algorithm, this algorithm is asymptotically optimal if the graph is tree-like. And I'm going to skip the technical details here, but this would allow us to show that the one-sided allocation remains optimal when we're in this subcritical regime where the graph is sparse. Now, what about the opposite? What about the regime where B is smaller than 1 or the regime where the graph is denser? It turns out that in general, one cannot generalize to these settings because the result can be flipped. The balanced allocation can now become a better design. So recall that at the beginning, very few of you actually chose the balanced allocation. So here is the intuition for why the balanced allocation could actually become a better design and in what type of markets we expect it to be the case. So intuitively, the balanced allocation is better because regular node on one, let me show you the plot to make this point more straightforward. In the balanced allocation, if you look at each regular node, each of them has some chances to form neighbors with both flexible as well as regular. However, in a one-sided allocation, this is not the case. If you look at the regular nodes here, they actually have very small expected degree. They don't have a lot of neighbors because all of their neighbors are also regular. And in contrast, the regular nodes on this side, they could benefit from a lot of flexible nodes. So the problem is really with the regular nodes on this side. In a setting where alpha F is small, so basically regular nodes are very difficult to form edges. In this case, these nodes are very likely to be isolated and thus unmatched. Now, one could actually show that the expected, if we count the expected number of isolated edges, is always minimized in the one-sided allocation in this case. So of course, a maximum matching metric is much more complicated than just counting the number of isolated edges, isolated nodes. But this shows that there is a problem of asymmetry with respect to the one-sided allocation that could make it a suboptimal design. And to show this, we show that actually this is particularly problematic when alpha is large and alpha is small. Why? To see the intuition here, let's consider a setting where alpha F is so large that every flexible node is connected with every individual node on the opposite side of the graph. In this case, the optimal algorithm to find a maximum matching is actually to proceed in two stages. First, match the regular nodes among themselves. So basically just deal with these blue nodes. And then only use the flexible nodes to save any unmatched regular nodes. And in a setting where alpha is small, there are going to be enough regular nodes that remain unmatched from stage one. So the flexible nodes in the second stage will always be matched. And the problem really just boils down to how many regular nodes can be matched among themselves. And for this question, the balanced allocation is a better design because there are more edges in expectation within this balanced structure. And we can explicitly upper and lower bound that number of matches. And intuitively, we show a result of the flavor that the balanced allocation dominates if two things happen. First, the regular nodes cannot be easily matched, so alpha needs to be small. And flexibility needs to be valuable, so alpha F needs to be large. In exactly what type of markets, like these are parameterized by both the flexibility budget as well as the difficulty of matching irregular agents. And why would such a parameter regime be of interest? Let's consider a dense digital online market, say the freelancing market Upwork. On Upwork, it similarly has this type of flexibility like levers. For example, on the supply side, it builds something called an Upwork Academy to give free training to freelancers to help them develop skills so that they can be compatible with a wider range of customers. And on the demand side, it is also using something called a project catalog to offer a set of standardized tasks that can be fulfilled by a wide range of freelancers. So essentially what this result is saying is that in this case, it is actually really valuable or important to have flexible agents on both sides to help with the difficult agents on the opposite side of the graph. So for example, the certified freelancer should deal with the difficult customer, should deal with the demanding customers, and the customers that are easy to satisfy should be matched with non-certified freelancers. In contrast, if we only have certified freelancers but no standardized tasks, then the non-certified freelancers would find it very difficult to find a job on the platform. Now, let's close the loop by taking a complete look at the picture here. Here I'm going to visualize the ratio of the balanced allocation over that of the one-sided allocation. So if this ratio is greater than 1, it means that the balanced allocation is better. And intuitively, we should expect if this ratio is smaller than 1, it means that the one-sided allocation is better. And intuitively, we should expect this to be true when the graph is sparse. And we should expect this ratio to be greater than 1, meaning that the balanced allocation is better when we're in a market where flexibility is really valuable and the contrast between alpha F and alpha is high. And this is exactly what we see in this plot. We see that in either direction, actually the ratio could exceed 8%. So this is saying even if you have the same number of edges, depending on how you distribute these edges across the graph, the resulting matching outcome can be very different, and either design could beat the other by more than 8%. So this flexibility allocation question is really like a first order effect. Okay, so what we have done so far is to highlight these two effects that we call cannibalization and asymmetry, and the parameter regimes in which they dominate. It turns out that these effects generalize way beyond this maximum matching metric that we defined. So for example, if we look at the number of non-isolating nodes, we're going to see similar behavior. There's going to be a region where the one-sided / the balanced allocation dominates, and it can also be proved that either the one-sided or the balanced allocation, like these two extreme like the optimality always occurs at one of the two extremes. And similarly, if you look at greedy matching, like basically whenever a customer comes, you just match it, no matter like if you look at this greedy type of matching metric, it's also the case that either one-sided or the balance can be optimal. So this flexibility design question potentially applies to platform with various matching objectives. Okay. And now I'm done with all of the math. And using the rest, I guess, 10 minutes, I'm going to show you all about, like what this result could imply for a platform where you conduct experiments, as well as what type of like other extensions are doable based on this like parsimonious matching graph. So first of all, let's consider the cost component. Let's add back the cost component into the objective function. Previously, we've only looked at this mu function, which is like just the benefit that we get from flexibility. Now let's add the cost of flexibility as well. And here the linear cost is just for illustration purposes. So basically this more realistic function g, which you can think of as the profit, it captures both the matching probability as well as the cost of flexibility. If we were to plot this function g in a setting where alpha f and alpha are small so that flexibility cannibalization dominates, this is what we're going to see. So on the z-axis, we have the profit function, and we want it to be as high as possible. And on the x and y-axis, we respectively have BL and BR, which are the flexibility penetration across the two sides. So there are several things that we can observe from this plot. The first thing is that flexibility allocation is a significant aspect of platform efficiency because we can see a huge optimality gap between a suboptimal balance allocation and the optimal one-sided allocation. And the second thing, which I think is more interesting, is all of these diagonals that are highlighted here, and they actually highlight different kinds of geometries. So this blue curve here highlights concavity. So it is saying that when we hold flexibility on one side and increase flexibility on the other side, we're going to see concavity. This is sort of expected because this is saying like, when you add more edges into the system, this is saying like there is decreasing marginal return to additional flexibility. So similar to this competition idea, like maybe this is not exactly the competition that you mentioned, because I guess when you say competition, you're referring more to like when one driver gets the job, the other one doesn't get it, something like that. I think in this case, this is saying like if we are thinking from a platform's perspective, where the goal is just to maximize matching, then when you add the first few like additional edges, it's very valuable, but as you add more, it's becoming less and less valuable. So this is the standard, concavity type of result that we should expect from like additional value flexibility. But what is surprising is that aside from this concavity, there is also convexity in this curve. So for example, in this case, if we look at like if we hold the flexibility budget but move from one side to the other side, we're also going to see a convex objective. And this interplay of concavity and convexity here implies the existence of a saddle point on the surface of this function that can really make it difficult for platform to conduct experiments. So for example, at Uber, the team that I worked on is responsible for managing incentives of eaters, so basically the demand side. And there is a similar team that works on the supply side, like incentives for couriers. Now, as these two teams conduct experiments, they're always going to see concave objectives because they're operating on these blue diagonals. So each of them optimize their own team, and thus they only see concave objectives. And at this point in the middle, neither of them have an incentive to move because they're locally optimal. But jointly, the platform is actually now stuck at the suboptimal situation as compared with the global optimal. And in this case, it is much better to decrease flexibility in one team and increase it on the other side. So basically saying that, for the money that you have spent to incentivize drivers, you may as well just use the same money to actually double down on rider incentive. So costly mistakes can be made without coordination of the two sides. And if we're in a platform where alpha F is much larger, like an online digital platform, where flexibility asymmetry dominates, the geometries could look even more complicated. And all of this highlights an understanding of the two structural effects to guide platform experimentation. And using the last 5 minutes, let me just quickly walk you through several extensions that are possible based on this modeling framework. The first extension is a so-called local model. So basically, local model means that instead of assuming each node can make edges with all nodes on the opposite side, we will assume that they can only make edges to their k closest neighbors. So for example, this graph is assuming k is equal to 2. Now, in this case, we'll need to modify the edge probability to divide it by k rather than n to ensure that we're still in an interesting regime where not all nodes are just always matched. Now, in this case, for the case where k is small, for example, alpha f for the case where k is small, alpha f and alpha also needs to be small. And in this case, again, we see that cannibalization dominates. It is always the case that one-sided allocation is optimal. But as we gradually increase the magnitude of k and consequently the range of alpha f and alpha, we'll gradually recover this flexibility asymmetry aspect, and eventually we converge to the global one. So this is saying that even if you just have a graph with local structure, you should expect to see the same type of effects. Another extension that we looked at is a spatial model. So a spatial model is maybe the model that fits the right-hand network the better. So the idea is that there are going to be unwriters and undrivers that are ideally distributed in a unit square. And in this case, flexibility is really just, like their coverage radius, like how far a write I'm willing to take. And there would only be an eligible edge between a writer and the driver if their coverage radius has an intersection. In this case, what is interesting is that the linearity assumption breaks. The different allocations, for example, even given a single flexibility budget B, the different allocations would lead to a different number of expected edges because of this, this convolution here. And among all different allocations, the balanced allocation is the one that leads to the most number of edges. So you can imagine this must give a benefit to the balanced allocation. And indeed, what we see is that on top of the graph that we had before, something changes. In this super sparse setting, where both alpha f and alpha are small, the balanced allocation now dominates. Why? Because this is the sparse setting where the number of edges is close to the number of matches. So imagine you have a platform where there's almost no competition. Like as soon as a writer and the writer shows up, it's highly unlikely that you're matched with anybody else but each other. In this case, the effect is almost purely driven by just the number of edges. And thus, in this case, the benefit of the balanced allocation in creating more edges directly translates into more matches. In contrast, as we look at the other regimes, we still see these regions where cannibalization dominates and the regime where alpha f is much larger than alpha. It is much better to have a balanced allocation. So essentially, what we're seeing here is a juxtaposition of the edge effect on top of this original model. Now, if we were to introduce even more asymmetry into the system and think about an imbalanced graph where one side of the graph is significantly shorter than the other side, what we're going to see here is going to be another type of edge effect. And in particular, even for the one-sided allocation, depending on whether you allocate flexibility to the left-hand side or the right-hand side, the resulting outcome can be very different. So for example, if you incentivize only the left-hand side, because each one of them is incident to a much higher number of potential neighbors, it is much more valuable to have flexibility on the short side rather than the long side. So we're going to see another kind of edge effect that significantly favors the allocating flexibility only to the short side. Okay, so why have we talked about this? We have talked about the study of two-sided flexibility in matching platforms. We have seen that it's a significant aspect of platform efficiency. We've talked about these structural effects, cannibalization. We describe a kind of waste when there are flexible nodes on both sides, as well as this asymmetry effect that describes what happens when we don't have flexible nodes on the opposite side to save some difficult to match agents. And we've seen that this implies joint and non-local experimentation is needed on platforms, along with various extensions. But of course, there are a lot more to study. So for example, what happens when we think about a decentralized matching platform? What happens when the matching is online? So all of these are open questions. And more broadly, my research revolves around this idea of flexibility in platforms. This includes both algorithm design ideas of what is the optimal customization and timing aspect of flexibility. So these are works mostly around online algorithms, as well as works on market design. So for example, as we think about introducing autonomous vehicles to the platform, what does that imply? How do we most efficiently utilize this hybrid supply source? And there are also works at the intersection of the two, such as the work that we see today. And in the future, I plan to look at various extensions in those directions. So for example, on the algorithm front, I'm going to look at the charging and repositioning of AVs, which is an integral part of what I currently work on at Waymo. And also in the future, I plan to look at the partnership between an AV-only platform. So for example, Waymo today, and how it both competes and partner with traditional ride-hailing platforms like Uber and Lyft. Okay, so that's about it. Thank you very much.
Questions from the audience?
Yes.
And I was super interested. One of the takeaways about the experimentation, about the convexity and the concavity.
Yes.
I'm curious, pushing back a bit, how specific this is about platforms. Because I would imagine that there's like this game theoretic aspect of the saddle point that you can generalize to, I mean, some firms with
Exactly.
multiple teams that have conflicting incentives.
Exactly.
Generally.
In fact, one of the literature that our work is most related to is this so-called like within an organization, there is this alignment between different teams and this type of literature. I think we don't require platform. The only thing that we need is the fact that it is two-sided. So it's not about, like the only thing that is required of a platform is that it is a centralized decision maker that tries to coordinate two sides.
Oh.
So the construct of this platform construct is really just there to say that there is a central decision maker that decides both the supply side and the demand side.
It's more about the multi-objective.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Kind of one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, could be, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess platform has more levers, like pricing and this type of thing, you don't typically expect from like a larger organization that has this incentive issues. Yes.
So you characterize the matching probability like alpha, was it alpha and alpha?
Yeah.
I'm guessing those parameters would be kind of characteristic to the platform.
Yes.
Because each platform would use different
Right.
strategies or algorithms
Yeah.
to actually match in real time. So do you have to tune those parameters when you actually try to deploy this kind of?
I think there are two answers to this. The first is, how do we know for a platform what the alpha F and alpha is? This, like, in fact, there is a very intuitive interpretation of alpha F and alpha, because alpha F and alpha is exactly the expected number of edges, like that are incident to a node in a large network. So for example, if you look at Uber, if a regular driver, typically there are 5 compatible riders to this driver, then alpha is equal to 5. And if a flexible rider, like the typical number of like incident neighbors, like compatible drivers is 10, then alpha F is 10. So this is roughly how to interpret it. Now coming to implementation, I'm by no way suggesting that Uber should adopt my parsimonious matching model, because this is not what I used. So this model is mostly to provide an illustration of the effect. But in practice, the way that platform could use it is that, I have this plot that shows all this type of geometries. And this type of geometry is exactly what platform gets if they do enough experiments. So instead of relying on this particular construction of, this matching model, platform should instead do their own experiments and be able to, at least in the regime that they care about, they could do experiments to see if additional flexibility is valuable. And all this is saying is that when they do actually do these experiments, it is important that they coordinate the two sides, because otherwise they might get trapped in those errors.
A question on looking at these two kinds of geometries. I think if we just look at this, I think the takeaway is given a fixed budget, either 0B or half B will be the minimum or the maximum. But I guess maybe in reality, you may want to allocate in different ways. So what kind of relaxation of your assumption or model setting will bridge this from this stylized model to reality?
In fact, there are various ways to I think the fundamental reason why it's optimal to either do exactly symmetric, one-sided, balanced, or one-sided is due to the symmetric structure of the model. Now, one easy way to break this is, for example, if in this cost component, if you assume that the cost of incentivizing different sides is different, then you naturally get an interior optimal point. So this is a very easy way to break the model. Now, if you believe that your intrinsic matching model is still symmetric, but just the cost is different, it actually doesn't change all of this convexity concavity results, because all of these are just first order information. So yeah, this is one way to extend to those settings. Yes.
Thanks for the interesting talk. So if we extend this model to some kind of decentralized setting where the supplier side has a power to select out of the nodes.
Ah,
And then can this model can be thought of as an information design setup where you, where the platform provides signal to,
yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah, I think so. Because intuitively, like the first mover should have some sort of advantage. Like, because if I'm flexible and I'm selecting, when I make my selection, I actually account for, like I think this matching is going to be very smart as compared with the situation where like only the side that is being selected would be flexible. So my intuition is that I should favor the supply side. But you're right, this could be some sort of like, like having the knowledge of whether the market has competition or not, and whether like knows whether the other side is willing to be flexible, I think could be interesting to that question. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. So what I understand is that you have a fixed budget and try to allocate the budget to be able to maximize the number of matches. Do you think in any way this can be helpful in answering the question, what is the budget that you should set? Because to me, that would be like the ultimate supply side of the equation, is how much budget you should set.
Yeah, I think to some extent there is a similar like construct. Like platform is essentially trying to select DL and DR individually. So I think like when they do experiments, they are like when they explore this in like the area that like when they explore around their operating point, they're essentially going to somehow like get an understanding of how the surface looks like and be able to like identify this globally optimal point, which really has these two variables as opposed to just this allocation question. So if you map this allocation question back to this plot, the allocation question is studying only this red curve here. It's only like fixing the budget and choosing different points in this curve. But if a platform does enough experiments such that it can construct like a local surface, not just this individual line, then it can potentially move in a globally optimal direction. Yeah, but without a perfect simulator or enough experiments, like answering any of this question would be difficult.
Thank you again. Our next speaker will be Will McNeil, who's an Call alum and currently a postdoctoral fellow, energy postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. He will talk about a wide range of topics on environmental and economic impact of large load in connector. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.